Hi, I'm Allie, and I'm living chronic faith. Thanks for stopping by, and welcome to the podcast. The name says it all. I believe that our faith has to be as chronic as our symptoms, and this podcast is a safe space for us to explore meaningful ways to live our lives according to that faith. It's my prayer that after this episode, you will be more encouraged, more educated, and more equipped to live out your chronic faith. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this discussion. I am with the illustrious Dr. Lamar Hardwick, the autism pastor, and I'm so excited to hear what he says about our bodies being our friends. Dr. Hardwick, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh my goodness, it is a pleasure. I first came across your work when I was doing some research, and so I would just love for you to share a little bit about your story with everybody who's watching.
Sure. Well, most people who know me online for the past, I guess, maybe 10 years now, know me as an autism pastor. I'll share a little bit later about where that came from. I'm not actually the person who came up with that title. It's an interesting story that I'll share later. But that's because I was diagnosed on the autism spectrum as an adult. I was age 36. Although I tell people around the age of 7 or 8, I knew there were some significant differences between me and my peers. I just didn't have the language to describe how I experienced the world at that time. I'm a husband of 23 years. My wife and I have been married. I'll be 24 years in January. So we're college sweethearts. We met when we were 18. So I've been together since then. We have 3 beautiful boys. One is 19. He's a sophomore in college. Our middle child is rapidly approaching 16 and wanting to drive. And our youngest is 11 in the 6th grade. So we got a college sophomore, a high school sophomore, and a middle schooler. And I have been a pastor in various capacities for over 20 years. I've pastored 3 different churches. I've also served as a youth and young adult pastor in my earlier days. And then also I spent almost 4 years as a hospice chaplain. A lot of people don't know that. I served as a hospice chaplain working with families who are facing life-limiting illnesses, and that was a very challenging but fulfilling ministry. And I guess the last thing I can say is I'm also an author and a scholar. Authored 4 books, 2 about disability. One was Disability in the Church, which won a Reader's Choice Awards. That was released in 2021. And my most recent book is How Ableism Fuels Racism, where we kind of explore the history of slavery and how it has an attachment to disability discrimination. And so, yeah, that's pretty much what most people know about me and what I usually share with people about who I am.
Wow, thank you so much for introducing yourself. Disability in the Church was definitely my introduction to your body of work, and it resonated with me on so many levels, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you said something that I found very interesting. You said that when you were about 7 or 8, you started to notice some significant differences in how you experienced the world. And I think that that's so relatable to a lot of people with chronic diagnoses, because we are living in a body that operates differently than the bodies of people around us. And it's often hard to have the language to communicate it in an understandable way to people what your experience is like. What was that like for you to function as a child and then as an adult, as a father, husband, and pastor, having those symptoms but not really having a diagnosis?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously I can look back now after being diagnosed. I was diagnosed at age 36. And I often tell people this is something that's very important. I didn't just get the diagnosis from the clinical psychologist. I actually stayed with her for about 2 years, both my wife and I, to just sort of process the history. A lot of things that you asked about in the question, I had to
Mhm.
process because I did spend 36 years without a
Right.
diagnosis. And so what I tell people is that it felt like the world was in on an inside joke that I didn't understand.
Mm.
If you understand
Wow.
autism, people with autism can sometimes have a co-occurrence of an intellectual disability. I did not, so I did okay academically. And there's scores of people like me who are diagnosed with autism but don't have a co-occurrence of an intellectual disability. And so our primary challenges are, um, I tell people there's a time around 18 months to 2 years old where your brain starts to be able to translate what I call, or creates a translator in your brain for body language, right? And so we've all heard that 90% of all communication is nonverbal. We talk with our bodies, the way we stand, our facial expressions, voice intonation, when you fold your arms, just things that
Mhm.
become intuitive to most people around the age of 18 months or 24 months or 2 years old. You start to understand those things, and your brain can translate them. For people who are autistic, our brains don't. And so if you can imagine, 90% of what people are saying is with their bodies, but my brain doesn't get it. And so
Mhm.
it can be very challenging, to answer your question, to operate as a child without that diagnosis, because everybody around you is assuming that your body functions the way that theirs does. And
Mhm.
so, while I did okay academically, really socially is the challenge, because people are saying things with their body, with their voice intonation. I know now that I didn't get sarcasm because a lot of that depends on the way people say it, the timing of how they say it, the
Mhm.
voice intonation. And so you can understand that it can be very challenging. And even though I did well academically, to be honest with you, the way that our world is set up, most of how you succeed and excel is by the ability to make people like you.
Mm.
So you can be smart
So
as a child, but if your teachers don't understand you and don't like you because they think you're defiant or
Mhm.
disobedient, a lot of the labels I got, right, because I didn't understand body language, I didn't understand voice
Yeah.
intonation and facial expressions, things that people use to communicate their pleasure or displeasure with you. I didn't
Yes.
understand all those things. So I didn't understand why people had problems with me. I didn't understand why people didn't seem to like me. I didn't understand why I thought a conversation was great. Moving into adulthood, I would think conversations are great, and people would think that I was either arrogant or
Mhm.
aloof. And so that even became challenging as an adult, because when you're wanting to get employed, the system is you have 45 minutes in an interview to make that person like you, regardless of whether or not you can do the job.
Yeah.
So that was challenging, talking about adulthood before I got a diagnosis, because it was hard for me to sometimes get a job, but it was hard for me to keep a job up until I started pastoring and really kind of found my niche. I don't think I kept a job longer than 2 years, because usually that was around the time people started noticing what they would consider to be strange and weird, and sometimes behavior that was detrimental to my ability to maintain that job. And a lot of it had to do with whether or not people liked me.
Mhm.
So yeah, that it was very challenging all through childhood and adulthood. I tell people I have had some successes, but I've had some rough successes. I stumbled into a lot of things because of that. And then there's other things that come along with autism, like sensory processing issues. I'm very sensitive to light and sound,
Mhm.
and it can really be damaging to me mentally and emotionally to be in loud environments. I have aversion to strong smells. Um, there's also executive functioning challenges sometimes, which sort of functions like dyslexia, like my brain reorders
Mhm.
instructions sometimes. So I tell people, if you give me tasks to do, usually just one at a time. Let me do that and then come back. Don't give me 3 or 4 things because my brain will scramble them up. And I know what you want me to do, but if it's supposed to be done in a certain order, it becomes very challenging. So all those things were challenging as a child, and even moving into adulthood until I got a diagnosis and had the language to share with people, this is the best way to interact with me, because then I can be
Yes.
able to, you know, meet your expectations. But also I felt human, I think, for the first time when I got diagnosed, because all the negative things people said about me, I realized it wasn't my fault.
Wow. That's very relatable as well, because I think having a way to talk about what's happening with you
Hmm.
is very empowering,
Yeah.
right? Not that you owe anyone an explanation or any type of apology, but just
Hmm.
being able to articulate, this is what my needs are.
Hmm.
These are the boundaries that I need to put in place. This is how you can help me, because that's a big conversation too,
Right.
is not just needing help, but needing help the way that is helpful to you.
Hmm. Yeah.
So how did receiving a diagnosis change the way you approach life and how you manage all the roles that you play?
Yeah, it's exactly like you said. Like I finally found the language, and I actually did a lot of
Mhm.
research and learning. And one of the ways that it changed the way that I did things is that I was actually pastoring at the time. And so one of the things that led me to even get the diagnosis is that I was a youth pastor at a church. I had been brought into a church, in a small city, in Southwest Georgia. So it was a small city, but it was a big church.
Okay.
Um, and so, it was the largest church in the city, and there's lots and lots of people there. And I was working with the youth, and I like to joke, that all youth are socially awkward. So we kind of fit in together. As a matter of fact,
Mhm.
that what kind of grew the ministry, because all the kids in the city who went to various high schools and middle schools who were sort of outcasts found comfort in what we were doing in the ministry. So I actually,
Mhm.
when I got there, it was 12 kids. By the end of the year, I had 150.
Um,
So it was like all of the outcasts, all the kids that nobody wanted to hang out with started coming to our church. And what actually drove me is when my predecessor resigned, and the church liked the way that I preach, and so they wanted me to preach and teach in the adult service, but I had to interact more with adults, and that's when it started to really
mm,
hit the proverbial wall. I was hearing a lot of things like he's not approachable, he looks angry all the time, he's not social. Um, he walked past me, he didn't speak. All things that are reflective of being able to pick up on social cues and those
um,
types of things.
yeah.
So when I did get a diagnosis, what it did is it helped me to have a sense of relief, but also to
Yeah.
tell people, look, all those things that you're saying about me may be true, but I would never intentionally do that to hurt anyone. This is what you need to know. And
Yes.
like you said, it wasn't because I felt like I owed them an apology, but I also wanted them to know this is how you can experience me in a way that you want to experience me, what you think you're trying to experience. And so it helped me. I spent almost a year at that church when I became the lead pastor, just training my staff on understanding
Mm,
neurodivergence, and understanding me and how my brain works. And this is, I told the elders of that church, if you let me do the things that I do well, and then provide accommodations for me for the things that I don't, you'll get the best version of me. The church will get the best version of me. You
yeah.
won't be frustrated. I won't be frustrated. And it'll just work much better that way. And so it actually changed the way that we did church. We reorganized the way we did a lot of things, all because I got a diagnosis and I was able to communicate to people, what they needed to know about me. I wasn't apologizing for how God made me, but I was
Yeah.
telling people, this is how God wired me, and this is the best way to experience what you want to experience. And that even transitioned over into fatherhood and marriage, right? Which is why I say my
Yes.
wife and I spent 2 years with her because we had a good relationship, primarily because my wife is from Malawi in Africa. So when we started dating when we were 18, we just assumed that we were so different that we had to work very hard at communicating, because she's from a totally different continent, grew up
Right.
different than I did. So we just went into it with the assumption we got to work hard at understanding each other. But it did help when I got a diagnosis to explain some things and to help us to communicate better. We use a lot of written communication now because I can process that a lot better, especially because when people are talking and there's a lot of emotions involved, I'm missing a lot of what people are doing with their bodies. So I'm
Yes.
like, write it down, let me know so I can process it. And that also helped with raising children, so it really did help. And again, I like how you said not having to apologize, because one of the things that I struggled with initially when I got diagnosed was feeling like I had failed a lot of people because,
Mm,
I ruined relationships, or I didn't respond in a way that somebody thought because I didn't understand what they were saying without saying it.
yeah.
And so, yeah, it helped me, and it really made me a better pastor, to be honest with you, a better father and a better husband, because I understood myself. And I think that's a gift that God gives us, is to be able to understand how He created us and not to have to apologize for that, but to be more self-aware and then
Yes.
tell the world this is the way that my body interacts with the world around me, and I'm fearfully and wonderfully made.
Amen.
It just looks different from how you're created.
That correlates so much to my personal experience, and I'm sure the experience of a lot of others who are watching this with chronic illness, that
Hmm.
there are things that happen in your body that others will never understand, that sometimes you don't have the language to express. Uh,
Hmm.
but again, it's not something that you have to be apologetic about.
Hmm.
But the more that you do understand and educate yourself about the situation, as you said, become more self aware of how maybe your actions or your habits are perceived by other
Hmm.
people,
Right.
the more understanding that you can build and the stronger your relationships can become.
Hmm.
So I love the path that you were heading down, talking about how this is how God allows you to be, how He made you, and that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And I want to just talk a little bit about that because our focus is our bodies being our friends.
Hmm.
And in my situation, there were many days where I was saying that my body was against me, that it was fighting me,
Hmm.
and God corrected my language and reminded me that through all the things that my body has experienced, that it has been fighting for me.
Hmm.
It's been supporting me. It's been compensating when I didn't even know what I needed to do. My body knew it was designed that way.
Hmm.
Do you consider your body to be your friend?
Yeah, that is such a great perspective. And I'll say that I do now. I don't know that I always did. Um, and I'll say this as a pastor and as a theologian. I think, for those of us who are Christians, sometimes the reason why we struggle with accepting our body as our friend is because a lot of how we interpret some of the things that Paul says about, the contest between flesh and spirit. We've all heard that.
Mhm.
And I think, and this is probably in the West, this is where I did a lot of my research. So I can't speak about global Christianity. I can speak about Christianity in the West, particularly in the US.
Yeah.
I think we've interpreted those scriptures in a way that has sometimes been harmful to people with
Yes.
disabilities and chronic illness, because we have painted a picture of what Paul says about the spirit and the flesh as a contest
Hmm.
between the body, almost in a way that the body is rebelling against the spirit, in a way that it makes it appear as though our bodies are our enemies.
That's so good.
And so I think, as a theologian, I think that's a very harmful interpretation, um, particularly for people like us with, disability or chronic illness, because we internalize that sometimes.
Yes.
And when the bodies that we've been given sometimes don't operate in typical ways, or as you say, they compensate for things that we're not even aware that they're compensating for. There's this desire sometimes internally, because we've absorbed how we've been taught, to assume that the way that we've been created or the bodies that we have are unacceptable
Mm.
to God. And so we have this craving based on this idea that we should, battle against our bodies. And so you get this theological concept that, part of my faith journey is to have enough faith to override the things that my body is telling me that it needs,
Yeah.
or that is important for how it interacts with the world. And I think that's part of why we struggle with that. So, I would say now I do see my body as my friend, because I've sort of unpacked and I tell people, the deconstruction is a buzzword that everybody's using. I like to say I unsubscribed to some
I like
things.
that.
You know how you get emails and you're like, when did I subscribe to that? When did I,
Yeah.
agree to this? Right. And it's sort of the way
Mhm.
with our beliefs. Like, when did I believe, when did I start believing that my body is not my friend? And so I had to start unsubscribing to some things that were adjacent to things that I was taught, and realize, that's not helpful the way that it's been interpreted and given to us. So I had to unsubscribe to that and realize, my body is my friend.
Yeah.
I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. The body that God gave me, the neurology that God gave me, can actually be a gift. That's not to say there's not some challenges there.
Okay.
But I tell people, the reason people like the way I write, the reason people like the way I preach, the reason why people want to have conversations with me like what I'm having with you, is because of how God wired my brain. And so
Yes.
while there's some challenges there, there's some giftedness I was able to sift through and find and
Mhm.
nurture. And so, yeah, I really do now believe that my body is my friend. And a lot of times I've learned to not fight with my body and not see it as a
That's good.
contest between my body and my faith, but to see how my body is helping me work out my faith and then live out that faith. I actually, last thing I'll say about this is very interesting, because I'm working on a new work. I have been doing some research, and I found that there's a whole contingency and a discipline that says that our bodies actually, the way that they move throughout the world, actually help us interpret abstract ideas like faith and
Mm.
goodness, justice. And so, whether we realize it or not, the way that our bodies function actually is the way that God wired it to help us interpret those things, right? And so,
Wow.
there's not a fight with my body. My body is actually what's helping me process what it means to be good, what it means to have faith, and it's processed in a way that is unique to how my body moves throughout the world. So that's when I discovered that, I'm like, that's awesome. That's something that people need to know.
It definitely is, and it's very powerful because, again, the more that we understand ourselves, the
Hmm.
better that we connect with others, and the more that we can connect with the purpose that God created us for.
Hmm.
And so I love that you talk about sifting through and finding those giftings and those things that you were anointed for, maybe amidst the challenges and amidst
Hmm.
all the things that you've experienced, which brings me back to this moniker as the autism pastor.
Hmm.
Tell me why you chose to brand yourself that way. You said the name came from somewhere else.
Yeah. So actually, I was diagnosed in 2014, but I had done about a year's worth of my own research prior to that. So
Okay.
I was pretty sure. Um, So when I went to get the diagnosis, it was more of a confirmation, because I started reading articles and finding out about other adults who had not been diagnosed as children, but found later on that they were autistic. And so it was like, oh, this is what people have been saying about me my whole life. This is what it is. So I told my wife, I think I know what my challenges are. I think I know what some of our challenges are. So by the time I got the diagnosis, it was more of confirmation. So very early on, I started writing and blogging, really for a lot of other platforms. I didn't really have my own website yet or anything like that. And so the moniker autism pastor actually came from a parent. I don't even know where she is to this day. It was almost 10 years ago.
Wow.
She inboxed me. This is maybe a year into me blogging and writing, and said that you are like the pastor for the autism community,
Wow.
because a lot of us don't get the opportunity to go to church either because
Hmm.
the church doesn't understand what to do with our children. They haven't had good experiences with church, which I found was very common for people with disabilities and chronic illness. And so when she said I'm like the pastor for the autism community, because at that time I was doing a lot of praying with families. Before Zoom was cool, I was using Skype and meeting with families, and we were talking and praying together. And I was like the only pastor they had. Um, so it just kind of clicked. I'm like, well, autism pastor. And so quite honestly, I just changed all my social media handles to that because it made it easier for people to find me. So when people are like, oh, you should look up the autism pastor, it was a lot easier for them to remember that.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of where that came from. But I kept it because, and I'll be honest with you, I had some pushback from people, some people in my own church
Imagine.
who said, well, why would you label yourself Latin? I remember having a conversation with one of my parishioners about it, who was very, very upset. I'll say that, why would you limit yourself like that? Why would you label yourself? And I said, well, the only reason why it would be a problem is if you think those two words don't go together.
Mm. Oh.
So part of the reason why I kept it is because it's my way of protesting the idea that people with
Yes.
disabilities cannot be used by God.
Mm.
So it became sort of my pushback against this idea that, well, those two things don't go together. Well, if God says
Yes,
they
yes.
do, they absolutely do.
They
And
absolutely.
and I'm gonna, as you said earlier, not apologize for what I've found out about myself, but I'm also going to be very vocal about it and open about it so that you can see God used me. And I'll say this last thing I'll say about that question. People ask me all the time, like, why do you talk about being autistic? And, for those who follow me on social media, I'm also currently in treatment for stage 4 cancer. And people are like, why are you so open about that? And I say, I like to let people know what I'm up against so that they can see what God is up to.
Yes.
And a
Yeah.
large part of that's just, and everybody's not called to this, but I am. A large part of that's being vocal and being vulnerable and transparent and open, because when you know the things that I'm up against, and you can clearly see what God is up to, and that's my goal, is
Mm.
to see what God is up to.
That's beautiful. It can be very challenging when you do express openly, the challenges that you're facing physically or medically.
Hmm.
Um, One of the things that I have learned in my own personal journey, and I share this with the LCF community all the time, is you get to assign these diagnoses their place in your life.
Hmm.
You don't have to let it be in the driver's seat,
Right.
but you also don't have to shove it in the trunk and try to pretend like it doesn't exist. This
Hmm.
is part of the way that we experience life. But how do we interpret that? And how do we interpret it through the lens of how God sees us?
Hmm.
And so that brings me to this question, which is how do you understand and communicate the idea of being both called and diagnosed?
Yeah, another great question. I think I'll go back to what I just shared. Is I want people to know that it doesn't have to be a conflict, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't have to be one or the other. Um, a great example of that, if we want to look into the Bible, is the calling of Moses, right?
Hmm.
Now, a lot of people think that Moses. I think today, if Moses was alive, he'd be diagnosed with a disability because he talked about how he didn't speak well.
Absolutely.
He said, "I'm slow of speech. I don't speak well." And then some people would give me pushback on that. And I tell them, well, and say, well, it's not a disability. I said, well, the reason why you can assume that it is you look at God's response to Moses.
Right.
When God says, I know, right? And then he says, who makes man's mouth? Who makes people speak or not speak? Who makes, people see or not hear? It's me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I love about that story is that even God never denies that Moses has some challenges with speaking well. What he did do is say, I'm going to give you an accommodation to help you fulfill your calling. He says, I'm going to send you your brother Aaron. He's going to
Mm-hmm.
be with you. And I tell people that's the first, what I call divine accommodation, right?
Mm-hmm.
God says, I'm still calling you. I know you have some challenges. I'm still calling you and you're still qualified. But I also know that you need some accommodations to fulfill this calling on your life. So I'm going to provide that for you. And so one of the ways that I try to communicate that is say, look, having a chronic illness or disability does not disqualify you from being used by God in any way. And so I strongly advocate in my book, Disability in the Church, to have people in your church or your faith organization or your school to be leaders.
Yeah.
But then also, if we're going to follow the pattern of God, is we create environments and help accommodate people who have chronic illnesses or disabilities. We provide accommodations so that they can fulfill their calling, right? And so
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be either or. It's both and I just need you to follow the Spirit as we see God provide accommodations for Moses to fulfill his calling, provide those accommodations for other people. And sometimes that looks like doing things different. Sometimes that means reevaluating what we define as a leader. Sometimes it means putting aside some of our preferences and some of the things that we believe make someone qualified and actually look into what God is doing in this community and see that it's not a conflict. And we need more people with chronic illnesses and disabilities helping to lead our organizations because we can help shape the church and our schools and whatever else it is that we want to talk about. We can help shape it to become an environment where we see more people with chronic illness and disabilities helping lead us, but also helping teach us because, again, we have oftentimes a unique experience and a unique way of experiencing God that I think helps strengthen the church. So it doesn't have to be a conflict. It is something that I think is necessary in helping build up the body, and that's one of the ways I try to communicate that.
Wow. So for anyone who is struggling with accepting that they might benefit from accommodations, God provided an accommodation for Moses and his brother Aaron. I love that
Mm,
perspective. It's not one that I've heard from anyone else except for you,
mm,
uh, but it is an empowering thought for people who resist that, who don't want to use assistive devices or who don't want to use their ADA accommodations, people who feel like they need to present as typical in the
mm,
world,
yeah.
but understanding that God provided that accommodation for Moses because he recognized, I created you with this gift and with this purpose. And
Hmm.
I also understand that there is someone who will come alongside you to make sure that purpose is accomplished in you. I love that perspective and I appreciate you sharing that.
Mm.
For people who haven't gotten enough of hearing from you in this conversation and want to continue hearing more, would you tell us about your new podcast?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that. So I previously had a podcast a couple years ago called the Autism Pastor Podcast. And it was just me, it was solo. Part of the reason why I was not active in the last couple of years is because I was undergoing cancer treatment and just wasn't able to keep with the schedule. But for the viewers and the attendees, I'm doing much better. I feel good. Um, and so I have partnered with a good friend of mine, brilliant woman, Dr. Teresa Lee, and we sort of played off of both of our last names, Hardwick and Lee, and we have launched what's called the Hardly Typical podcast. The tagline is insights and intersections, and so we discuss everything that intersects between race, faith, disabilities, socioeconomic status, gender, all things that play into how people with disabilities and chronic illnesses, and we even touch mental health a little bit, how we experience the world. And so, yeah, that podcast actually launched on Labor Day. Episode 3 just came out, where we talk about this new movie called The Deliverance.
Yes.
On Netflix. But really, it was less about the movie and more about, how sometimes people with disabilities or chronic illness have been told that they are quote unquote sick because of either a lack of faith or demonic influence. So we even though the movie's not directly related to that, we realize for people with disabilities and chronic illness, that can be a trigger, because a lot of them have been told you need to be delivered in order to get your chronic illness or your disability. And so we touched that and, had a little bit of fun with it, but also had some serious theological discussions about it. So yeah, you can find that podcast on all the podcast platforms, and we encourage people to subscribe, even to the Hardly Typical Substack. And just take this journey with us. We like to say we're not just launching a podcast, we're building a community. So we're inviting people to join in and also interact with us. Tell us what you think, questions, comments, and we'll address those issues as well.
Amazing. Dr. Hardwick, thank you so much for being with us and just for sharing your insights. This has been absolutely incredible.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed our conversation.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. If you want to stay up to date on what's happening in the LCF community, or for more faith-first chronic diagnosis content, please visit our website at livingchronicfaith.com. And while you're there, consider registering for membership free of charge. Also, check us out on Instagram and YouTube at Living Chronic Faith. Be sure to follow and subscribe. Remember that I'm praying for you. Yes, you. And until next time, always expect great things. Talk to you soon.